The Morrison house had never been quiet. Not when George and Helen first bought it in 1976, with the naive conviction that a split-level suburban home could contain both their ambitions and their 3 small children. Not when those children grew into adults with loud, dissonant desires of their own. And certainly not now, nearly 5 decades later, when 4 generations, grandparents, their middle-aged children, and the children's children, were crowded beneath its roof. The walls seemed to vibrate with competing rhythms. George, 73, still rose at 6 every morning as if his retirement were a temporary furlough. He slammed cabinet doors, muttered about coffee filters, and unfolded the newspaper with military precision. Helen, 2 years younger, followed more slowly, wrapped in her robe, irritated by George's noise but unwilling to admit that her own arthritic slowness was the real problem. She grumbled about his messes, his tone, his breathing. They were a duet of recriminations polished by decades of repetition. Downstairs, their eldest son, Mark, nursed a midlife unease he refused to name. At 46, he carried the aura of someone who had worked dutifully but without distinction, who had provided without flourishing. He came home each night with the hollow look of a man who had long ago given up the fantasy of escape. His wife, Carol, occupied the kitchen like a general defending lost territory. She measured her worth in meals cooked, laundry folded, grievances catalogued. Their 2 children, Sam, a college dropout whose online business ventures fluctuated between promise and collapse, and Lily, a high school junior simmering with adolescent contempt, floated between dependence and rebellion. Sam had taken up residence in the basement, claiming entrepreneurial necessity while quietly avoiding adult responsibility. Lily roamed with earbuds permanently implanted, her sarcasm sharper than her grades. And then there was David, the younger Morrison son, who had moved back in after a divorce. He was 40, once considered the family's bright hope, graduate degrees, teaching career, a marriage that had seemed enviable until it collapsed under the weight of competing ambitions. He slept in what had once been his childhood bedroom, its walls still faintly bearing the ghosts of baseball posters, its corners now cluttered with divorce papers and unwashed laundry. This was the household into which every day's friction poured like water into a cracked basin. Small irritations pooled, never absorbed, never drained. The grandfather's conservative mutterings about kids these days collided with Lily's eye rolls. Helen's insistence on correct table manners clashed with Sam's habit of eating over the sink. Carol's sharpness with her daughter curdled against David's protectiveness, which in turn inflamed Mark's jealousy. Dinner was the daily battlefield. George insisted on prayer. Lily rolled her eyes and muttered about hypocrisy. Carol demanded gratitude for her cooking. Sam pushed food around his plate and left early to take a call. David tried to lighten the mood with anecdotes from his students, but they were received as either pretentious or irrelevant. Helen sat in the middle, correcting grammar, as if linguistic precision could mask the family's collapse. What was strangest was how ordinary it all seemed. Each member of the household had grown so accustomed to conflict that they barely noticed its accumulation. The house smelled faintly of mildew and reheated casseroles. The television in the living room was always on, though no one ever truly watched it. Someone was always sighing, someone else was always resentful. Yet beneath the surface irritations, deeper wounds festered. George still hadn't forgiven Mark for abandoning the family hardware store in the late 90s, forcing its closure. Helen resented Carol for what she saw as an emotional stinginess, though she would never voice it directly. Mark carried the humiliation of his father's disappointment like a hidden bruise. David lived with the bitterness of a marriage that had failed publicly, and with the sense that his family saw him as damaged goods. Sam's entrepreneurial ventures were viewed with skepticism verging on contempt. And Lily, though outwardly disdainful of the family circus, absorbed every fracture like a sponge. The Morrisons had once prided themselves on being close-knit. Now, proximity was their punishment. They were bound less by affection than by inertia, by the inability or unwillingness to go elsewhere. A family of separate islands crowded into one archipelago. On Sunday mornings, George still drove them all to church, a ritual that combined piety with obligation. Helen fussed over hats and coats. Carol checked Lily's skirt length, prompting another skirmish. Sam stayed home, working. David tagged along, sitting stiffly in the pew, as if testing whether belief might return if he waited long enough. The sermon spoke of forgiveness, of grace, of family unity. The words hovered in the rafters, never landing. Sometimes, late at night, Helen would wander into the living room and sit in her chair, the television still glowing. She would think about the years when the house had felt like possibility instead of weight, when the children were small, when George's temper seemed manageable, when laughter occasionally drowned out criticism. She would wonder, not for the first time, how a family could become so adept at living together without truly seeing one another. The house itself bore witness. The wallpaper peeled in the upstairs hallway, but no one repaired it. The carpet smelled faintly of dog, though the dog had died years ago. The kitchen faucet dripped a slow, unfixable rhythm. Everything sagged. The couch cushions, the stair rail, the faces of its inhabitants. And yet, in the middle of all this, there lingered the faintest ache of hope, an unarticulated desire that maybe, somehow, something could shift. No one said it aloud, for fear of sounding naive. But in the cracks of silence between arguments, in the moments when George softened enough to help Lily with her homework, or when Carol touched Mark's shoulder without criticism, or when Sam quietly handed his grandmother a cup of tea, there was the ghost of another version of the family, one less strangled by resentment. It was into this tenuous household, with its invisible fractures and ordinary miseries, that a new presence would soon enter. And though no one yet realized it, her arrival would disrupt the practiced choreography of complaint, forcing the Morrisons to confront the possibility that their claustrophobic life could be something else entirely. If the Morrison household could be described in a single word, it would be friction. Not the cinematic kind that explodes into plate throwing or slammed doors, but the quieter, slower, more corrosive version. Sighs in hallways, silences at dinner, muttered corrections, and the sense that every gesture came preloaded with resentment. The day usually began with coffee and conflict. George measured out scoops with military precision, then criticized anyone who dared do it differently. Helen corrected his pronunciation of espresso for the 1000th time, insisting it wasn't espresso. Mark shuffled in late, bleary-eyed, and Helen scolded him for leaving wet towels in the bathroom. Carol bristled at the implication that she wasn't keeping the house in order, while Lily, half asleep at the kitchen counter, muttered that nobody cared about towels when the world was burning. Breakfast became an endless negotiation of irritations. Sam clattered upstairs from the basement, insisting he was working, even as his hair stuck out like a warning sign of sloth. George asked when he was going to get a real job, prompting Sam to launch into a defensive speech about the future of e-commerce. Helen tried to referee by asking Sam about his latest project, only to misunderstand the jargon and trigger more frustration. Carol insisted the kitchen wasn't an office. Mark retreated behind his newspaper, pretending not to hear. By 9 in the morning, the atmosphere already resembled a battlefield in which everyone was fighting the wrong war. The rest of the day followed a similar rhythm. Carol vacuumed with the intensity of someone scrubbing her conscience, muttering about crumbs that nobody else seemed to notice. Helen followed, pointing out streaks left on the floor. Mark wandered in from work with the defeated air of someone entering not his home but an interrogation chamber. George launched into monologues about the decline of American values, which Lily countered with sardonic remarks gleaned from TikTok. Even small chores became arenas of conflict. Who left dishes in the sink? Who forgot to lock the back door? Who overwatered Helen's plants? Each accusation carried not just the weight of the moment but decades of layered resentment. When George barked at Lily for leaving lights on, he wasn't just angry about electricity. He was revisiting every disappointment he'd felt toward his children and grandchildren. When Carol snapped at Sam for leaving his shoes in the hallway, she was channeling years of feeling taken for granted. Dinner, inevitably, was the day's climax. It always began with George's insistence on prayer, which Lily mocked under her breath and Sam ignored by scrolling his phone. Carol tried to serve dishes still steaming, but Helen pointed out they were too salty or too bland. Mark attempted to redirect the conversation to neutral topics, sports scores, local news, but his effort sounded forced, like a man whistling in the dark. David, ever the peacemaker, offered anecdotes from his students, which Helen dismissed as trivial and George waved away as liberal nonsense. Inevitably, someone would leave the table early. Sometimes it was Sam, storming off under the pretense of business calls. Sometimes it was Lily, exasperated by another round of conservative lectures. Sometimes it was Carol, muttering that she cooked for ungrateful mouths. The table would scatter like a dismantled camp, plates half full, conversations unfinished. The Morrisons had perfected the art of living together without connection. They inhabited the same rooms, passed one another in the hallway, exchanged functional information: who's using the car? Did you buy milk? But rarely acknowledged the deeper currents of emotion beneath. It was safer to argue about dishes than about disappointments. Easier to snipe about towels than to confess loneliness. Helen sometimes tried to revive the old notion of family unity. She suggested game nights, only to be met with groans. She proposed attending church dinners, which Lily refused and Sam ridiculed. She once bought a jigsaw puzzle, hoping to gather everyone around the table, but the pieces sat untouched in the box, a silent monument to her optimism. The irony was that they all felt trapped by the same weight but blamed each other for it. Mark resented his father's criticism, but he repeated the same tone with his own children. Carol despised Helen's nitpicking, but she mimicked it in her constant supervision of Lily. Sam hated being belittled, but he responded with arrogance. Lily wanted freedom, but she clung to the very house she mocked, as if its suffocating presence were preferable to the void outside. At night, the house itself seemed to sigh under the weight of accumulated grievances. Doors closed harder than necessary. Television volume wars erupted between George's political shows and Lily's YouTube. The smell of reheated leftovers drifted through the air, mingling with the faint mildew in the carpet. David, lying awake in his childhood bedroom, listened to it all with the ears of someone half inside and half outside the family drama. He saw the absurdity, but he also felt the ache of it. He remembered dinners from his youth when arguments had at least been counterbalanced by laughter. Now, the household had calcified into an arrangement of irritations, each member convinced they were the only one enduring it. The friction didn't explode, it eroded. It wore everyone down, dulled their better instincts, and made kindness feel like an extravagance. And yet, beneath the routine of sighs and sharp words, there was the faintest sense that they were waiting, though for what, no one could articulate. A change, a disruption, something to break the endless cycle. They didn't know it yet, but that disruption was already on its way. Part 3. The Arrival. The wedding day was less a celebration than a performance of obligation. In the Harper household, joy rarely appeared without first being tested, argued over, and rendered into something unrecognizable. The old house, with its dark wood trim and carpets that smelled faintly of mildew, had seen too many holidays spoiled by quarrels, too many dinners aborted in silence. The family gathered now, in suits that didn't quite fit and dresses chosen more for propriety than delight, to welcome a new presence into the fold. Her name was Claire, 26, from a smaller town an hour away, the kind of place people in the Harper household dismissed as provincial until reminded of their own origins. She had studied social work, though she wasn't currently practicing, and carried with her an air of calm competence that was somehow both fragile and magnetic. At first, no one quite knew how to take her. The matriarch, Eleanor, surveyed her with the same suspicion she reserved for all outsiders, eyes narrowed, lips pressed, a quiet evaluation of whether this newcomer would make her sons softer or weaker. The siblings, each long accustomed to turning meals into battlefields, regarded her as one might regard a foreign exchange student, interesting, perhaps, but bound to misunderstand everything important. And yet, from the moment she crossed the threshold of the Harper home, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't anything she said, her words were ordinary, even cautious, but in the way she occupied the space, as if she hadn't come to compete or defend, only to share the room without pressing too hard. At dinner that night, the test began. Dinner in the Harper household was where skirmishes ignited. Over money, over jobs, over who had visited last and who hadn't. Plates were passed with a minimum of civility, and usually by the second helping, someone had left the table in frustration. Claire, seated between her new husband Daniel and his younger brother Martin, did what no one expected. She asked questions. Not the perfunctory ones, "How was your day?" or "What's new at work?" but questions that carried genuine curiosity. To Eleanor, she asked about the recipe for the green beans, and whether it had been passed down. Eleanor, caught off guard, straightened her back, as though reminded she possessed something worth handing down. She spoke about her own mother's kitchen, about summers spent shelling beans on the porch. The others listened, surprised. It had been years since Eleanor spoke of her childhood without cynicism. Later, when Martin made one of his usual biting remarks about Daniel's career, Daniel, always the underachiever, the one who never earned quite enough, Claire didn't defend or scold. She tilted her head, as though Martin's bitterness were less an attack than a puzzle. "You must care a lot about your brother," she said softly, "to keep such a close eye on him." The table went quiet. Martin flushed, muttered something about joking, and for once did not pursue the argument further. It was in these small turns, these unexpected redirections, that the family felt the air change. No one would have said it aloud, but they felt it, the way a thundercloud begins to lift even if rain still lingers. Over the following weeks, Claire became not just Daniel's wife but the household's anomaly. She rose early to help Eleanor with the dishes, though Eleanor insisted she needn't. She listened to Daniel's father, Richard, repeat the same story about his union days without showing impatience. With the younger cousins, she sat on the floor and played board games, laughing with a looseness that made the children gravitate toward her. Her presence did not erase the old tensions. Martin still sulked, Eleanor still critiqued, and Richard still nursed his disappointments. But the edges softened. Arguments that once stretched for hours now dissipated after minutes, diverted by Claire's quiet interventions or simply by the fact that her presence made prolonged hostility feel embarrassing. One Sunday afternoon, the family gathered in the living room after lunch. Normally, by this point, half of them would have retreated, to the porch, to their rooms, to anywhere but one another. But this time, they lingered. Eleanor sat with her knitting, Richard in his recliner, Daniel and Martin on opposite couches. Claire, noticing the heaviness, asked if anyone wanted tea. She returned with a tray, the mismatched mugs steaming, and handed each one as though the act itself were ceremonial. No one left. For nearly an hour, the Harpers sat together in relative peace, the sound of spoons clinking against cups the only punctuation. It was a small moment, but in the Harper household, it was unprecedented. And still, beneath the surface, the fractures remained. Claire could not erase decades of grievances, nor did she try. But she made staying in the same room possible. She gave them the smallest taste of what it might be like to belong to one another again. The test would come later, when the novelty wore thin and the old resentments reasserted themselves. For now, in the weeks following her arrival, Claire became the fragile hinge on which the family rested, a reminder that even in a house long haunted by bitterness, a new presence could open a window. The family didn't yet call it hope. They didn't trust hope, but they recognized that something, however tentative, had shifted. And for the first time in years, they allowed themselves to remain at the table until dessert. Part 4. The Fracture. The Harpers had never been a family built for harmony. Even in the weeks following Claire's arrival, weeks that seemed, to Daniel at least, like stolen time from a different life, there lingered the certainty that the old habits would return. Families, like landscapes, have their natural climates. You could plant roses in a desert, but sooner or later the sand and sun would remind you what belonged. It began, as it always did, with money. Richard, the patriarch, had worked 35 years at the steel plant, carrying with him the pride of someone who'd earned everything with his back and his hands. Daniel's job at the community college, teaching part-time, grading papers late into the night for meager pay, had always seemed, in Richard's eyes, a kind of betrayal. Claire's presence had softened Richard's critiques at first. She had the effect of making him remember his manners. But by the third month, when the novelty of her gentleness had worn thin, Richard's voice hardened again. "You can't live on that," he barked one evening at dinner, stabbing a piece of chicken with his fork. Adjunct wages aren't a career. Not when you've got a wife to support. The room stiffened. Daniel flushed, staring at his plate. Eleanor, sensing an old argument about to reignite, tried to cut in with talk of the weather, but Richard was relentless. You should have gone into something solid. A trade, like Martin. Work with your hands. Work that matters. Martin, seated beside him, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. It was Claire who spoke. Daniel's work matters, she said quietly, her voice calm but steady. Teaching changes lives. Maybe not in a way you can count in dollars, but in a way that lasts. Richard stared at her, astonished not so much by her words as by her audacity. No one contradicted him at the table, not for long, anyway. Sweetheart, he said, the word thick with condescension, that sounds nice. But nice doesn't pay the mortgage. Claire met his gaze. Neither does bitterness. The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. Eleanor put down her fork. Martin coughed into his napkin. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest, half in shame, half in awe of his wife. That night, after the dishes were cleared, Richard retreated to his recliner and turned up the television louder than usual. The message was clear. Claire had crossed a line. From that evening forward, the atmosphere in the house shifted again, though not in the same way as before. Where once Claire's presence had lightened the air, it now seemed to charge it with static. Eleanor, too, began to bristle, not openly, but in the way her compliments to Claire carried the faint edge of critique. You're so good with the children, she'd say, probably because you don't have your own yet. Or, it's nice you help in the kitchen, though of course I don't expect you to understand how we do things here. Martin, who had once been almost charmed by Claire's attention, now found himself irritated by her tendency to diffuse his sarcasm. He had built his identity around being the sharpest voice in the room, the one who could cut through pretense with a single cruel remark. Claire's gentle reframing made his wit look juvenile, his grievances petty. Only Daniel remained steadfast, clinging to Claire as if she were the only proof that life could be different. But even he began to feel the strain of her position. At night, lying beside her, he confessed his worry. They'll turn on you, he said. They already have. My family, this house, it doesn't change. Not really. Claire brushed her hand across his hair. Then let them turn. We don't need their permission to love each other. But it wasn't so simple. Families, like gravity, pull. The breaking point arrived one Sunday, when Richard insisted that Daniel help Martin repair the shed roof. Daniel, who had promised Claire a day trip to the river, refused. The refusal alone was enough to trigger an explosion. You think you're too good for real work? Richard shouted from the porch. Too delicate to swing a hammer? I'm not delicate, Daniel snapped, surprising even himself. I'm tired of being treated like I'm nothing because I don't live your life. I chose my own, Eleanor gasped. Martin, red-faced on the ladder, barked down. Then stop living in this house like a leech. The words hung heavy. Daniel froze, staring up at his brother, then at his father. For years, he had swallowed these accusations, let them harden inside him. But this time, with Claire's hand tightening around his, he couldn't. I pay what I can, Daniel said, his voice shaking. But you don't actually care about money. You care about control. You want everyone here to owe you, to bend to you. Well, I won't anymore. Richard's face went purple. Don't talk to me like that in my house. It's not a house, Daniel said. It's a prison, and with that, he turned, leading Claire back inside. The fallout was immediate. For days, the house seethed. Richard refused to speak to Daniel. Eleanor clattered dishes louder than necessary, muttering about disrespect. Martin glared whenever Claire entered the room. Only the children continued to gravitate toward her, unaware of the adult wars raging above their heads. Claire held her ground, though the weight of it showed in the lines of her face. They hate me, she admitted one night, her voice cracking. They hate me too, Daniel replied, pulling her close. But maybe hate is just love that's been twisted too long. Maybe we can untwist it. Neither believed it entirely, but both clung to the possibility, as one clings to a rope over water too deep to swim. The Harper household had always thrived on fracture, but this fracture felt different, more final, more dangerous. It was no longer about small grievances, but about who would define the family's future. Would it be Richard, with his iron rules and unyielding pride? Or would it be Claire, with her quiet insistence that love could mean something gentler, freer? In that tension, the house quaked. And everyone knew, though no one dared say it, that something would have to break. If the fracture had left the Harper family stunned, the attempt at repair came less as a plan than as a reluctant necessity. A household could not run indefinitely on silence, no matter how loudly the television blared or how hard dishes clattered. Bills still had to be paid, dinners cooked, roofs mended, and children tended to. In the mundane machinery of daily life, even bitterness had to give way to function. It was Eleanor, surprisingly, who first broke the impasse. One Saturday morning, she announced that the family would eat dinner together, everyone, no excuses. Her tone carried not the softness of a suggestion but the brittle firmness of command. For years she had presided over the Harper table, arranging plates like offerings, enforcing the ritual of mealtime even as the conversation curdled. Perhaps she hoped that, by reviving the old ritual, something of its former power might return. Claire helped set the table, moving quietly, aware that every small motion was being judged. Richard entered last, lowering himself into his chair with the dignity of a man attending a trial. Martin came in muttering about wasted time, but he sat. Daniel took his place beside Claire, his hand brushing hers under the table. For several minutes, only the sounds of cutlery filled the room. It might have stayed that way if not for one of the children, Martin's youngest, who, with the guileless cruelty of kids, asked, "Why are you all mad at each other?" The question landed like a stone in a pond. Silence deepened, then broke into ripples. Richard cleared his throat, prepared to scold, but Claire leaned forward. "We're not mad at each other," she said gently. "We're just learning how to listen again." The child considered this, unconvinced but willing to let it pass. The adults, however, felt the weight of her words. Richard stabbed at his meatloaf. Martin rolled his eyes. Eleanor studied her plate, but Daniel squeezed her hand, grateful. That dinner was awkward, brittle, but it marked the first step. Over the weeks that followed, small gestures accumulated. Eleanor began inviting Claire into the kitchen, not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of resigned curiosity. She showed her the family recipes: meatloaf, chicken pot pie, stews meant to stretch across days. Claire listened, asked questions, and even offered her own additions: fresh herbs, a lighter hand with salt. Eleanor sniffed at the changes, but she didn't forbid them. Richard remained harder. He spoke little to Daniel, less to Claire. But once, when the lawnmower sputtered, he allowed Daniel to help fix it. The two men worked in strained silence, exchanging only the words necessary for tools. And yet, when the engine roared back to life, Richard grunted, "Good," in a tone that wasn't praise but wasn't dismissal either. It was, Daniel realized, as close as his father might come to concession. Martin resisted longest. His sarcasm sharpened whenever Claire was in earshot. But one evening, when he returned home drunk from the bar, it was Claire who helped him up the stairs, who fetched water and aspirin, who said nothing the next morning. He didn't thank her, but he didn't snipe at her for several days afterward, and in the Harper household, that counted as progress. The true test came during the fall storm. Heavy rain swelled the river near town, flooding basements and sweeping branches across the road. The Harper's roof, long in need of repair, sprang leaks in 3 rooms at once. Buckets were fetched, towels soaked, tempers frayed. It was Claire who organized the chaos. She directed Martin to the attic, coaxed Daniel and Richard into working side by side, reassured Eleanor that the children were safe. Something in her calm steadiness steadied them all. Even Richard, grumbling, obeyed her instructions. By midnight, the leaks were patched temporarily, the worst of the storm passing. Exhausted, the family gathered in the living room, dripping and dirty. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they laughed together at the absurdity of it. Buckets overflowing, Martin covered in insulation dust, Eleanor furious about her ruined carpet. The laughter was jagged, uneven, but real. Daniel watched his wife then, saw how her presence had shifted the gravitational pull of the family. She had not erased their flaws or healed their resentments, but she had made it possible, at least, for them to sit together without tearing apart. The attempt was not perfect. Arguments still flared, about money, chores, the weight of the past. Richard would never fully approve of Daniel's choices. Eleanor would never entirely stop resenting the intrusion of another woman into her kitchen. Martin would always carry the sharpness of envy and failure. But something had cracked open. At dinners, conversation no longer died instantly. The children lingered at the table. Even Richard, on rare occasions, told stories from his factory days, his voice softening with memory. Claire had not saved the Harpers. Families were not machines to be repaired. They were organisms, stubborn and wild, prone to relapse and relapse again. But she had done something perhaps more remarkable. She had given them the chance to breathe, to see one another not as enemies locked in endless skirmish but as flawed, fragile people bound by the accident of blood and the choice of love. On a late autumn evening, weeks after the storm, the Harpers sat once more around the dinner table. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, the light was warm, the food plain but plentiful. For a moment, a small, precarious moment, they felt almost like a family again. And perhaps that was enough.